For half a century, the United States enjoyed what economists quietly call the most extraordinary privilege in human history. It wasn't just military dominance. It wasn't just technological superiority. It was something far more profound, far more invisible, and infinitely more powerful. The ability to print paper and exchange it for real goods from anywhere on the planet. This wasn't magic. It was architecture. Financial architecture built on a single audacious agreement struck in the desert heat of Saudi Arabia in 1974, when American diplomats convinced the world's largest oil producer to accept only one currency for the black gold that powered civilization itself: the dollar. Always the dollar. Only the dollar. That agreement didn't just reshape global finance. It fundamentally altered the physics of American power. Suddenly, every nation that needed energy, which meant every nation on Earth, needed dollars first. They couldn't buy oil in yen, francs, pounds, or marks. The transaction required American currency, which meant the world had to perpetually hold, earn, and accumulate dollars. This created a permanent, insatiable global demand for U.S. currency that operated independently of America's actual economic productivity. The implications were staggering. The United States could run massive trade deficits year after year, importing far more than it exported, because those dollars inevitably flowed back to America through treasury bonds and financial markets. Foreign nations weren't just willing to finance American consumption, they were structurally compelled to do so. The mechanics were brutally elegant. Saudi Arabia pumps oil. China needs that oil to power its factories, but China can't pay in yuan. It must first acquire dollars, typically by selling manufactured goods to America or buying treasury securities. Those dollars then travel to Riyadh in exchange for crude. Saudi Arabia, now holding mountains of dollars, reinvests them in U.S. assets, government bonds, real estate, equities. The dollars complete their circuit back to America, but the oil, the tangible resource, has left forever. This was the free lunch. America exchanged paper promises for energy, the fundamental input of modern civilization, and the paper always came home while the energy stayed consumed. The entire global economy became, in effect, a subsidy for American living standards. This arrangement, known as the petrodollar system, wasn't merely advantageous, it was the foundation of American hegemony in the post-Vietnam era. When the Bretton Woods system collapsed in 1971 and Nixon severed the dollar's link to gold, the currency faced an existential crisis. What backed the dollar now? What gave it value? The answer came 3 years later in those secret negotiations with the Saudis. Oil became the new anchor. Not a formal peg like gold, but something more robust, structural necessity. Every barrel of oil traded globally reinforced dollar dominance. Every petrostate accumulating reserves strengthened American financial markets. Every central bank holding dollars as reserves was functionally an unpaid agent of U.S. monetary policy. The geopolitical advantages compounded exponentially. America could sanction nations by excluding them from dollar-based systems, effectively cutting them off from energy markets. It could finance enormous military expenditures without the immediate tax burden that would cripple other nations. It could maintain reserve currency status not through competitive exports or productive supremacy, but through the sheer inertia of a system where alternatives seemed impossible. The Federal Reserve's decisions became global monetary policy by default. When the Fed raised rates, emerging markets suffered capital flight. When it printed money, inflation exported itself to poorer nations holding dollar reserves. American monetary sovereignty had become global monetary dominance. But systems built on structural necessity rather than earned competitiveness contain inherent fragilities. They depend on the continuity of arrangements that may not remain advantageous for all participants indefinitely. They assume cooperation from partners who may eventually calculate that the benefits of the existing order no longer outweigh the costs of subordination. They presume that alternatives will remain underdeveloped, that rivals will stay divided, and that the hegemon will exercise its privilege with sufficient restraint to prevent coordinated rebellion. For 50 years, these assumptions held. The petrodollar seemed eternal, unassailable, woven into the fabric of global commerce so deeply that imagining its absence seemed like imagining modern civilization without electricity. Then, quietly at first, the architecture began to crack, not from external assault alone, but from the accumulated weight of its own contradictions, from technological changes that made alternatives feasible, from geopolitical shifts that made alternatives desirable, and from a slow, inexorable realization spreading through capitals from Beijing to Moscow to Riyadh. The system that once served mutual interests had become a mechanism of control that increasingly served only one. The free lunch, it turns out, was always going to end. The only question was whether it would end gradually through managed transition or catastrophically through sudden collapse. That question, dormant for half a century, has now become urgently, undeniably relevant. The first tremors weren't dramatic. They didn't arrive with declarations or summit announcements. Instead, they manifested as quiet bilateral agreements, marginal adjustments in trade settlements, experimental currency swaps between nations testing the boundaries of what had seemed immutable. In 2010, China and Russia began settling some bilateral trade in their own currencies, a seemingly minor adjustment that Beijing described as merely enhancing financial efficiency. The language was deliberately banal, the implications deliberately understated. But what was actually occurring represented something far more consequential. Major economies were beginning to build the infrastructure for a post-dollar world, testing whether the gravitational pull of the petrodollar could actually be escaped. The motivation wasn't purely economic, it was existential. Nations had watched as the United States weaponized dollar dominance with increasing frequency and decreasing restraint. When Washington froze Iranian assets, expelled Russian banks from SWIFT, and sanctioned Venezuelan oil, it demonstrated something that had always been theoretically true but rarely exercised so bluntly. Access to the dollar system wasn't a right, but a privilege that could be revoked at American discretion. The dollar wasn't just a currency, it was a control mechanism, and control mechanisms invite the development of alternatives, especially when the controller demonstrates willingness to use that control as a weapon. What seemed like America's greatest strength was simultaneously creating the motivation for the system's eventual dissolution. The technological landscape was shifting in ways that made alternatives increasingly feasible. For decades, the infrastructure of global finance, corresponding banking networks, settlement systems, reserve management, had been dominated by Western institutions operating in dollars. Building parallel systems seemed prohibitively expensive and technically complex, but digital payment systems, blockchain technology, and modern telecommunications were dramatically reducing these barriers. China's cross-border interbank payment system, launched in 2015, provided a credible alternative to SWIFT for yuan transactions. Russia's SPFS system offered similar functionality. These weren't merely backups, they were foundations for an alternative financial architecture that could function independently of American oversight. Meanwhile, the actual economics of dollar dominance were becoming increasingly questionable for participants outside the United States. Emerging markets holding massive dollar reserves were effectively providing zero-interest loans to America, watching their purchasing power erode through inflation they couldn't control, determined by a Federal Reserve that prioritized American employment over global stability. The arrangement made sense when American markets provided unmatched investment returns and military protection justified the financial subordination. But as Chinese markets deepened, as regional security arrangements emerged, and as the costs of dollar dependence became more visible, the bargain looked progressively less attractive. Why finance American consumption at your own expense indefinitely? The real acceleration came not from China or Russia, but from an unexpected source: the Gulf states themselves, the original architects and primary beneficiaries of the petrodollar system. Saudi Arabia, the linchpin of the entire arrangement, began signaling openness to non-dollar oil sales. In 2022, reports emerged that Riyadh was in active discussions with Beijing about yuan-priced oil contracts. The Saudi leadership framed this as diversification, as maintaining good relations with their largest customer. But the strategic implications were unmistakable. If the kingdom that had guaranteed dollar exclusivity in 1974 was now willing to accept yuan, the foundational premise of the petrodollar system had fundamentally changed. The anchor was coming loose. Understanding why Saudi Arabia would even consider abandoning an arrangement that had brought it immense wealth and American protection requires understanding how profoundly the geopolitical landscape had transformed. China had become the kingdom's largest oil customer, dwarfing American purchases. Chinese investment in Saudi infrastructure, technology, and economic diversification projects exceeded anything the United States offered. More critically, the American security guarantee, the original quid pro quo for petrodollar exclusivity, had become unreliable. Washington's hesitance to respond forcefully to Houthi attacks on Saudi oil facilities, its chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan, and its evident desire to reduce Middle Eastern commitments all signaled that American protection couldn't be assumed. If the security guarantee was weakening while Chinese economic ties strengthened, why maintain dollar exclusivity? The broader trend extended far beyond oil. By 2023, central banks globally were reducing dollar reserve holdings at the fastest pace in decades, diversifying into gold, euros, yuan, and other assets. This wasn't coordinated conspiracy, it was distributed risk management by finance ministries that had concluded that dollar concentration represented a vulnerability. Brazil and Argentina began settling trade in local currencies. ASEAN nations expanded currency swap arrangements. India purchased Russian oil in rubles and rupees, explicitly circumventing dollar sanctions. Each individual transaction seemed minor, but collectively they represented the death of inevitability. The dollar wasn't being attacked so much as it was being gradually, systematically bypassed. What made this trend irreversible wasn't just geopolitical desire, but economic mathematics. The United States was running trillion-dollar budget deficits, printing currency at unprecedented rates, and demonstrating limited fiscal discipline. The more dollars Washington created, the less sense it made for other nations to hold them as stores of value. Inflation was no longer an abstract concern, but a tangible cost imposed on dollar holders globally. The privilege of printing the global reserve currency had enabled America to avoid hard choices, but it had also created the conditions for its own obsolescence. You cannot indefinitely dilute a currency while expecting others to treat it as precious. Eventually, they simply stopped participating in the illusion. That moment, long theoretical, had arrived.
The transition from gradual erosion to accelerating collapse occurred not through a single catastrophic event, but through a cascade of compounding decisions that revealed the petrodollar's vulnerability had crossed a threshold. What had been theoretical, the possibility of conducting global trade outside dollar rails, became operational. What had been unthinkable, major economies coordinating to reduce dollar dependence, became policy. And what had been dismissed as fringe speculation, the end of dollar hegemony, became a scenario that serious institutions were actively planning for. The change wasn't that alternatives to the dollar suddenly emerged. The change was that using those alternatives stopped seeming radical and started seeming prudent. The BRICS coalition, long regarded as a disparate grouping with more acronym than coherence, crystallized into something resembling a genuine counterweight. The 2023 summit in Johannesburg saw not just the original members, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, but expansion to include Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Iran. More significantly, dozens of other nations formally applied for membership or expressed serious interest. This wasn't merely a diplomatic club. It represented roughly 46% of global population and, critically, nations controlling vast energy reserves, manufacturing capacity, and commodity production. When this bloc began serious discussions about trade settlement in local currencies, commodity-backed currency mechanisms, and alternatives to dollar-denominated contracts, it wasn't posturing, it was infrastructure development for a multipolar financial system. China accelerated what it called Yuan internationalization with methodical precision. State-owned enterprises received directives to invoice in yuan wherever possible. The People's Bank expanded currency swap lines with dozens of central banks, providing yuan liquidity for trade settlement. Chinese policy banks offered financing for Belt and Road projects denominated in yuan, creating organic demand for the currency through infrastructure debt. Most strategically, China began accumulating physical commodities, oil stored in strategic reserves, massive grain stockpiles, metals inventories, reducing its dependence on dollar-denominated spot markets. Beijing wasn't trying to make the yuan the next global reserve currency overnight. It was methodically building parallel systems that would function independently of American financial infrastructure, then patiently waiting for network effects to take hold. Russia, having experienced the full force of financial weaponization after 2022, pursued an even more radical decoupling. Moscow demanded that unfriendly countries pay for natural gas in rubles, a requirement that European nations initially resisted before quietly accommodating through complex workarounds. Russian oil found eager buyers in India and China willing to transact outside traditional dollar mechanisms. The central bank dramatically increased gold reserves while reducing dollar holdings to near zero. More significantly, Russia demonstrated that a major economy could survive complete expulsion from dollar systems, not comfortably, not without severe costs, but survivably. This proof of concept was perhaps more damaging to dollar supremacy than any policy Beijing could implement. If Russia could endure financial nuclear war and remain functional, the ultimate enforcement mechanism of dollar hegemony had lost its absoluteness. The commodity producers began to recognize their structural leverage. For decades, they had accepted the logic that dollar pricing was simply how global markets functioned, immutable infrastructure like shipping lanes or telecommunications protocols. But that framing concealed a crucial asymmetry. Commodity producers needed buyers, but industrial economies needed commodities more desperately and more immediately. A factory without copper stops producing within days. A nation without energy collapses within weeks. Food importers without grain face political instability within months. The producers of these physical necessities didn't need dollars. They needed things dollars could buy. And increasingly, those things could be obtained through direct barter, currency swaps, or alternative payment systems that bypass New York entirely. The realization spread. Dollar pricing served American interests, not producer interests. Oil-producing nations began issuing yuan-denominated bonds, testing deep financial markets for alternatives to dollar debt.
The UAE opened yuan clearinghouses. Qatar negotiated long-term LNG contracts with Asian buyers priced in local currencies. Angola and Nigeria explored alternatives to dollar oil sales. Each move was presented as diversification or market expansion, but the cumulative effect was unmistakable. The automatic, unquestioned use of dollars for energy transactions was ending. It wasn't being replaced by a single alternative. There was no petrodollar moment equivalent to 1974's petrodollar agreement. Instead, energy markets were fragmenting into regional payment systems, bilateral arrangements, and multi-currency settlements. Fragmentation, not replacement, was proving to be the actual successor to dollar monopoly. The American response oscillated between denial and aggressive defense, neither particularly effective. Treasury officials insisted that dollar dominance remained unshakable, pointing to the currency's continued majority share in global reserves and trade invoicing. But those were lagging indicators, measuring the past rather than the trajectory. The relevant metrics, the direction of change, the development of alternative infrastructure, the willingness of major economies to accept short-term costs for long-term autonomy, all pointed toward continued erosion. Meanwhile, Washington's attempts to enforce dollar exclusivity through sanctions and financial pressure were generating precisely the motivation for other nations to accelerate their decoupling efforts. Every new sanction regime was simultaneously a demonstration of American power and an advertisement for why that power needed to be escaped. The Federal Reserve faced an impossible dilemma. Raising interest rates to defend the dollar's value would crash an American economy addicted to cheap credit, trigger a debt crisis in emerging markets, and likely cause a domestic political backlash. But keeping rates low and continuing expansive monetary policy would accelerate inflation, further erode confidence in dollar stability, and validate the concerns driving nations toward alternatives. There was no setting on the dial that preserved both domestic economic stability and international monetary dominance. The two objectives, compatible for 50 years when global demand for dollars remained insatiable, had become contradictory. The Fed could save the domestic economy, or it could save dollar hegemony, but the structural conditions that once allowed it to do both simultaneously had dissolved. By 2024, the question was no longer whether the petrodollar system would end, but how quickly the transition would occur and how disorderly it would be. Financial historians would likely mark this period as the inflection point, not because of any single dramatic event, but because the cumulative weight of incremental changes had shifted the system's equilibrium from stable to unstable, from self-reinforcing to self-undermining. The free lunch hadn't ended in a single day, but the restaurant was closing, the bill was coming, and America was about to discover what economic life looked like when you actually had to pay for what you consumed with something other than printed paper. The reckoning, delayed for half a century through monetary architecture and geopolitical coercion, was no longer avoidable. It was happening.
The collapse of the petrodollar system represents far more than a monetary adjustment or a geopolitical rebalancing. It marks the end of an economic model that has defined American prosperity for 2 generations, a model where the United States could consume significantly more than it produced, import more than it exported, and finance the difference not through competitive advantage, but through monetary privilege. When that privilege evaporates, the adjustment isn't technical or marginal, it's foundational. It forces a reckoning with economic realities that have been postponed, obscured, and papered over with printed currency for half a century. The transition from a world where dollars are universally desired to one where they're merely one option among many will reshape American living standards, government capabilities, and global influence in ways that are only beginning to become visible. The most immediate impact manifests in the mechanics of trade and consumption. For decades, America's massive trade deficit, importing hundreds of billions more in goods than it exported, was sustainable because those dollars reliably returned through treasury purchases and investment flows. Foreign manufacturers sold products to American consumers, received dollars, then recycled those dollars back into U.S. financial assets. The loop was closed. But when dollar demand weakens, when foreign actors become less willing to accumulate dollar assets indefinitely, that loop breaks. The dollars don't automatically return. Trade deficits that were previously financeable become unsustainable. The result isn't abstract, it's tangible erosion of purchasing power. Americans will discover that imported goods cost more, that the vast array of inexpensive products from Asia becomes less affordable, and that the consumption patterns enabled by half a century of privileged currency status simply cannot continue at the same scale. The implications for government finance are even more severe. The United States currently runs annual budget deficits exceeding $1 trillion, financed largely through treasury bond sales to foreign holders. China, Japan, and oil-exporting nations have accumulated trillions in U.S. government debt, effectively providing low-interest loans that enable American fiscal policy. But as these nations diversify away from dollars, As their appetite for additional treasury holdings diminishes, the buyer base for American debt contracts. Basic economics dictates the outcome. Fewer buyers mean higher interest rates required to attract capital. Higher interest rates mean exploding costs to service existing debt. The U.S. government already spends hundreds of billions annually just on interest payments. When rates rise significantly because foreign demand has weakened, that figure could approach or exceed $1 trillion annually. Money that produces nothing, builds nothing, defends nothing. It simply pays for past borrowing. This debt spiral creates impossible choices. Cut spending dramatically, which means reduced military capabilities, diminished social programs, and infrastructure decay. Raise taxes substantially, which means political upheaval and economic contraction. Or print money to cover the gap, which means inflation, further erosion of dollar credibility, and acceleration of the very flight from dollars that created the problem. There are no good options, only various degrees of pain. The luxury of avoiding these choices was precisely what petrodollar dominance provided. Without it, America faces the same fiscal constraints that discipline every other nation. The constraint of having to actually pay for what you spend with real economic productivity rather than monetary privilege. The geopolitical consequences extend beyond economics into the realm of strategic capability. American military dominance, the network of overseas bases, the ability to project power globally, all of this was financed not just through tax revenue, but through the implicit subsidy of dollar hegemony. When foreign nations finance your deficits at artificially low rates, you can maintain a military budget larger than the next 10 countries combined without bankrupting your economy. When that financing becomes expensive or unavailable, military expenditure faces the same constraints that apply to any other government program. Choices must be made. Which regions are truly vital? Which commitments can be abandoned? Which allies can be told that American protection is no longer guaranteed? The collapse of the petrodollar doesn't just reduce American power, it forces explicit acknowledgement of limits that have long existed but could be ignored while the monetary printing press remained globally accepted. The psychological and political adjustments may prove even more disorienting than the economic ones. Multiple generations of Americans have lived in a world where their currency was universally coveted, where American markets set global prices, where Washington's policy preferences could be enforced through financial mechanisms without firing a shot. This wasn't experienced as privilege, but as normalcy, the way the world simply worked. The transition to a multipolar financial system, where the yuan, euro, and digital currencies compete with the dollar on relatively equal footing, will feel like decline, even if it merely represents a return to historical norms where economic influence correlates with productive output rather than monetary architecture. The political discourse around making America great again or restoring American leadership will intensify precisely because the structural foundations of that leadership are eroding in ways that policy cannot easily reverse. Yet within this crisis lies a paradoxical opportunity. The petrodollar system, while advantageous, also enabled complacency. It allowed the United States to run persistent deficits, to underinvest in productive capacity, to financialize its economy rather than manufacture, to consume rather than produce. The discipline imposed by losing reserve currency privilege could, theoretically, force a return to economic fundamentals, investment in infrastructure, education, technology, and industries that produce tangible value rather than financial instruments. Nations that cannot print their problems away must solve them through productivity. Germany, Japan, and South Korea achieved remarkable prosperity not despite lacking reserve currencies, but partly because of it. They had to compete through quality, efficiency, and innovation rather than monetary manipulation. America possesses vast resources, technological capabilities, human capital, and institutional knowledge. The question is whether political systems designed during an era of unchallenged dominance can adapt to an era requiring genuine competitiveness. The historical parallels are instructive but not deterministic. Britain's loss of sterling dominance after World War II led to decades of relative decline, but eventually to a sustainable, if diminished, role in the global order. The transition was painful: austerity, devaluation, relinquishing empire, but not apocalyptic. The difference is that Britain's loss of currency primacy occurred during a period of American ascendancy within a broader Western alliance structure. America's loss is occurring in a more genuinely multipolar environment, without a clear successor hegemon and amidst great power competition. The landing could be softer or harder depending on how intelligently the transition is managed, how much domestic political dysfunction impedes adaptation, and whether zero-sum thinking or cooperative frameworks guide the international response. What remains certain is that the free lunch has ended.
The 50-year period where America could exchange paper for resources, promises for products, and printed currency for real wealth extracted from the global economy is closing. What comes next will be determined not by the monetary architecture of the past, but by the productive capabilities, institutional adaptation, and strategic wisdom brought to bear on challenges that can no longer be postponed through financial engineering. The petrodollar is dead. The question now is what America becomes in its absence. A nation that rediscovers competitive vitality through necessity, or one that clings to nostalgic illusions while the gap between pretensions and capacities grows unbridgeable? The answer will define not just American prospects, but the structure of global order for generations to come. History has resumed. The outcome is unwritten.